My name is Aurora Miller. I'm 27-year-old. My parents never truly looked at me and saw their daughter. Not really. To them, I was a spare piece on a chessboard, useful only if it helped protect their ambitions. The night they told me to leave their Lakeview brownstone with nothing but a single suitcase, the disbelief sat heavy in my chest like a stone. I remember staring down at my checking account app while standing on the sidewalk, the cold Chicago wind catching the ends of my hair. $3,120. That was all I had. 27 years old, and in that moment I was suddenly more alone than I had ever felt in my life. And 3 weeks ago something happened that changed everything. Something that forced every buried truth, every hidden document, every lie, every whispered threat, into the open. I inherited $1.35 billion from my grandfather, Leonard Whitmore, the man who built Whitmore Estates Group into one of the largest privately held real estate empires in the Midwest. But when my parents demanded I sign it all over to them, every dollar, every share, every asset, their polished facade cracked. And what came next exposed 15 years of secrets that would burn down the empire they thought they were entitled to rule. If you're listening to this, thank you for being here. These stories are not easy to tell, and it means a lot that you're on this journey with me. If any part of my story resonates, please subscribe and comment where you're listening from. I always read the comments, and they help more than you'd think. It all started the afternoon my grandfather's attorney called, just a simple notification that a meeting had been scheduled, but the tone in his voice, it told me everything was about to shift. To understand why that call changed my life, you need to understand who my grandfather was. Leonard Whitmore, age 80, the self-made visionary behind Whitmore Estates Group. People knew the empire, luxury hotels across the Midwest, investment properties from Chicago to St. Paul, entire commercial districts he developed from the ground up. They knew the numbers, $4.8 billion in total assets. But they didn't know him the way I did. They didn't know the man who spent every Sunday afternoon with me at his penthouse on 900 Lakeshore Drive, the walls covered in Pollock and Rothko originals he bought long before those names meant anything. They didn't know the warmth in his eyes when he asked about my job at Riverside Equity Partners, always listening like nothing in the world mattered more. They never saw how he handled the chess pieces, slow, thoughtful, precise, as though every move meant something. He used to say, "Aurora, in life, integrity is the only checkmate that matters." At 27, I only half understood. At 27 years and 3 weeks, I finally learned exactly what he meant. My father, Darren Miller, had been the chief financial strategist at Whitmore Estates Group for almost 15 years, Leonard's right hand on paper, but not in spirit. My mother, Elaine Miller, perfected the role of elegant executive spouse, charity galas, photo ops, carefully curated social circles. Their world revolved around status, exclusivity, control. But behind the closed doors of our home, the atmosphere was different. My father treated every family dinner like a negotiation. Slips of paper slid toward me with lines highlighted. "Sign this," he'd mutter. "It's standard procedure. No need for lawyers between family." His tone always casual, but the pressure unmistakable. Even back then, something didn't sit right. I worked at Riverside Equity, earned the position myself, no favors involved. And the deeper I dove into financial analysis, the clearer the gaps in his documentation became. In 2019, he brought me a stack of papers tied to an investment initiative involving offshore accounts. "Just a formality," he'd said. "You being part of the family makes your signature important." The pages were dense, full of vague language and loopholes. I refused. He didn't speak to me for 3 months. Mom called me ungrateful, accused me of disrupting family unity. But Grandpa noticed. He is always like that. And he never pushed, never judged, just quietly observed, as though filing away every detail. The more I think back, the more I see the truth. He spent the last 3 years of his life watching a storm gather around his legacy. waiting for the moment it would break. The moment arrived at the Winter Founders Gala on New Year's Eve, 2024. It was one of those impossible nights. String lights, champagne towers, the kind of glamour people post endlessly on social media to prove they belong. The ballroom of the Grand Lakes Continental Hotel was filled with Chicago's most powerful. My father worked the room like a man campaigning for something he was already convinced he owned. My mother floated beside him, smile flawless, jewelry gleaming. Grandpa excused himself from a conversation with two hotel developers and beckoned me to follow him through the private corridor leading to the study the hotel staff always reserved for him during events. I remember the way he closed the door quietly behind us, the muffled music from the ballroom fading into a distant hum. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a titanium key drive, silver, and waited. "When the moment comes," he said gently, "you'll know exactly what to do with this." His hands trembled, not with fear, but with certainty. "The password is your grandmother's birthday and our anniversary. Keep this safe, Aurora, and don't tell anyone you have it." I swallowed hard. "Grandpa, is something wrong?" His smile softened, but his eyes carried a heaviness I didn't understand. "Everything," he whispered, "will soon be exactly as it should be." I slipped the key drive into my purse, confused and somewhat unsettled. But when I looked back at him, he had already returned to his usual warmth, as though the conversation hadn't happened at all. January came and went with a strange tension in the air. My mother began asking more questions than usual about my bonuses, my savings, what investments I was considering. She spoke of family friends who had made fortunes using creative financial pathways, her brows lifting in a way that made every hair on my arms stand on end. My father approached me with another simple family formality, this time requiring my signature as a supposed board member of a subsidiary I had never heard of. The pages were thick and intentionally overwhelming. When I told him I wanted a lawyer to review it, his face flushed red. "We don't need lawyers between us," he hissed. "You either support your family or you don't." I held firm. He stormed off, muttering about loyalty. What I didn't know then was that Grandpa had been preparing something far bigger behind the scenes, something he'd quietly worked on at his penthouse every Sunday after I left. On September 15th, 2025, he died in his sleep. He was 80 years old, strong, sharp. Just the week before, he'd closed a $180 million development deal and talked to me about renovating 3 hotels in Milwaukee. His death hit me like a blow I wasn't prepared for. At the funeral at St. Augustine Basilica, the pews were filled with politicians, CEOs, longtime employees moved to tears. Dozens delivered speeches, newspapers printed tribute front pages. But as I watched my parents during the reception, I saw something that made my blood run cold. They weren't grieving. They were calculating. Mom stood in the coat room whispering into her phone, arranging early conversations with Hamilton and Rowe Fine Auctions about selling Grandpa's art collection, Pollock, Rothko, mid-century pieces worth tens of millions. Dad huddled with 3 board members near the refreshment table, talking about smooth leadership transitions, his voice low but urgent. He already had a stack of new business cards printed with his name under the title Chief Executive Officer. Grandpa's body had been in the ground for less than 3 hours. That night, my parents called an emergency family meeting at their Lakeview brownstone. The term family meeting in our household always meant one thing: their orders disguised as discussion. When I arrived, I found Benton, Shaw and Adler LLP attorneys already seated. On the dining table were documents spread like battle plans, trust transfers, asset assignments, powers of attorney predated and prepared. Dad gestured toward the stack. "We must protect your grandfather's legacy. Everything needs to be consolidated under experienced leadership." Mom's voice dripped with false concern. "And Aurora, honey, you have no idea what it's like to run a multi-billion-dollar company. You just analyze spreadsheets for a living. You need to listen to what we say." That night, I barely slept. Their voices echoed in every corner of my mind. 2 days later, on September 20th, everything was revealed. The reading of the will took place in the 38th floor office of Whitmore and Reyes Legal Group on North Michigan Avenue. My parents arrived 15 minutes early with their trio of attorneys, their expressions polished into masks of certainty. Jonathan Reyes welcomed us, calm as ever, and began reading. To my son-in-law, Darren Miller, and my daughter, Elaine Miller, I leave $1 each, having provided for them generously in life. Mom gasped. Dad clenched his jaw. To my granddaughter, Aurora Miller, I leave all shares of Whitmore Estates Group, all real estate holdings, investment accounts, and personal property. Current valuation approximately $1.35 billion. Silence vibrated through the room like a struck bell. Dad surged forward. This cannot be right. Read it again, Jonathan calmly continued. There is a condition. A mandatory 45-day independent audit of Whitmore Estates Group must be completed. Only after the audit is cleared will the transfer of inheritance be finalized. Mom exploded. He wasn't of sound mind. We'll contest this. Jonathan opened a folder. Your father-in-law anticipated that. The will includes a psychological evaluation performed 6 weeks prior. He was fully competent. That car ride home felt endless. When we stepped inside, the mask finally dropped. You've been poisoning him against us, Dad roared. Mom threw her purse onto the marble floor. You manipulated a fragile old man. You should be ashamed. They shoved the papers at me again. You sign these, Dad commanded. We will manage everything. The company cannot fall into inexperienced hands. I picked up the first form. It transferred every asset, every voting right, every decision to them. I would be nothing more than a ceremonial beneficiary. I need time, I whispered. His voice turned cold. You have until morning. At 11 p.m., I sat alone in my childhood bedroom. My suitcase lay half-packed at the foot of the bed. That's when I remembered the titanium key drive. My hands shook as I typed in the passwords. The screen opened. I found 15 years of meticulously documented evidence, emails, wire transfers, fraudulent invoices, fake vendor forms. My parents had stolen over $230 million, sometimes in small bites, other times in massive gulps disguised as consulting fees or development expenses. There were offshore shell companies, Blue Ridge Meridian LLC, Whitmore Horizon LLC, Miller Legacy Fund International. Some transfers were laughably blatant. Others were terrifyingly sophisticated. The final item was a letter addressed to me. Aurora, if you are reading this, then the truth has reached you. Darren and Elaine have taken from this company, its employees and its shareholders for over a decade. I documented everything to protect those who could not protect themselves and to protect you. You have the integrity this company needs. Trust Jonathan, trust the process, and trust yourself. Grandpa downstairs, I heard my parents arguing with their attorneys, planning their next steps, believing they still controlled everything. But in that moment, with that key drive glowing on the screen, I knew I would not sign a single thing. Not tomorrow, not ever. The following morning, I woke up before dawn to the faint echo of my parents' voices drifting up the staircase. Even through the walls, I could sense their agitation. Footsteps, whispers, the rustle of papers being shuffled across the dining table, the choreography of people preparing for battle. Sunlight slowly crept into my room, cutting across my half-packed suitcase like a spotlight on a stage I never agreed to perform on. I sat on the edge of my bed, heart beating steadily, the titanium key drive resting in my hands. I wasn't scared. Not anymore. The truth had settled inside me overnight, heavy but clarifying. I knew what I had to do. When the clock hit 7, I walked downstairs into the breakfast room. My parents sat at opposite ends of the long table flanked by their lawyers, steam rising from untouched coffee cups. They all looked up at me as though I were the hinge on which their entire future swung. Mom offered a pen before I'd even reached the chair. Aurora, let's not drag this out. Sign the papers. We'll handle everything. You'll thank us later. Dad clasped his hands together, jaw tight. You're running out of time. If the company slips into turmoil, it'll be your fault. Your grandfather would not have wanted that. Their attorneys avoided eye contact, each of them pretending they weren't witnessing moral implosion. I sat down slowly, letting the silence stretch. Then I said the words that detonated the entire room. I'm not signing anything. Mom blinked at me as though she didn't understand English. Dad froze, his coffee cup hovering midair. What did you say? He whispered, voice trembling with disbelief. I said no, I repeated more steadily. I won't be giving up my inheritance. Grandpa left it to me for a reason. For a moment, there was nothing but absolute stillness. Then the storm hit. You ungrateful child! Mom exploded, her face contorting into something I barely recognized. Dad slammed his palm on the table. You don't know what you're doing. You're 27 years old. You can barely manage your own apartment, let alone a multi-billion-dollar company. A tether snapped inside me. All those years, I said quietly. All those documents you pushed across the dinner table. All the pressure, the threats, the manipulation. And you want to talk to me about responsibility? My mother's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you implying? I met her stare. That I know everything. For a split second, I saw it, the flicker of fear behind both their eyes, quickly buried beneath desperation. Dad straightened his shoulders. Get out. If you refuse to stand with us, then you are no longer our daughter. Mom didn't even try to pretend sadness. Pack your things, you have 30 minutes. I left the room with my heart pounding but strangely steady. Their voices rose behind me, frantic, blistering, disbelieving, but I no longer felt the childhood instinct to shrink underneath them. I went upstairs, zipped my suitcase, grabbed the key drive, and took one last look at the room where I'd spent so much of my life, wondering why affection always felt conditional. Now I knew. I walked out the front door, the crisp September air hitting my face, and didn't look back. Standing on the sidewalk, luggage wobbling against my leg, I dialed the only person I could trust, Jonathan Reyes. He picked up on the second ring. They kicked you out, he said, not even phrasing it as a question. I have nowhere to go, I admitted. You do, he replied. Leonard prepared for this. The penthouse at 900 Lakeshore Drive is yours now. I'll notify the building. That ride to the penthouse felt surreal. Chicago whirred past the windows in streaks of grays and blues. I'd taken the same route so many times with Grandpa for our Sunday afternoons, but now the city looked different, bigger, sharper, full of cracks I hadn't noticed before. When I stepped out of the car, the doorman, James, greeted me with unexpected warmth. Miss Miller, welcome home. Mr. Whitmore told us to look after you. The elevator doors slid open and carried me upward, past floors of people living their own lives, their own stories, until they opened directly into the penthouse foyer. Harper Quinn, Grandpa's longtime household manager, stood there waiting. Her eyes softened when she saw me. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered, pulling me into a gentle hug that smelled faintly of lavender and warm linen. He knew you'd come. She guided me through the familiar spaces, past the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, past the side table where our chessboard still sat mid-game, as though nothing in the world had changed. And yet everything had. But the most important room was his study. Your grandfather left something for you, Harper said quietly. She moved aside a framed photo and pressed her thumb to a small panel I had never noticed. A concealed safe slid open. Inside were file folders, dozens of them, each labeled by year. The originals of everything on the key drive, every document, every invoice, every transfer. And one more item, a business card for Cassandra Holt, lead forensic director at Grant & Hale Forensics, one of the most respected auditing firms in the country. I think you'll want to call her, Harper murmured. I sat down at Grandpa's desk, hands trembling slightly, and dialed the number. Miss Miller, Cassandra answered immediately, her voice sharp and crisp. I've been expecting your call. Mr. Whitmore retained our services 6 months ago. We're prepared to begin the audit now. Within 2 hours, Cassandra and 3 senior forensic auditors were seated in the conference room of the penthouse, laptops open, papers spread across the table. Their presence radiated intensity and precision. The retainer, $600,000, had already been paid by an escrow account Grandpa established for this exact purpose. The 45-day window started on September 15th, Cassandra said. That gives us until October 30th. But your father has already scheduled an emergency board meeting on October 5th. He thinks he can force a leadership transition before the audit is complete. I swallowed hard. Can he? She gave me a small, knowing smile. Let him try. Jonathan arrived soon after, carrying additional files. They've already filed a competency challenge. They're claiming undue influence. It won't work. We have 3 independent psychiatric evaluations confirming Leonard was fully competent. But they will push as far as they can. I exhaled slowly. How bad is the fraud? Cassandra clicked on a spreadsheet. Conservative estimate, $230 million in unauthorized transfers over 15 years, potentially $520 million when we include interest, opportunity cost, and shadow subsidiaries. I felt my breath catch. All of that, gone? Not gone, she said calmly. Traceable. She tapped another folder. Your father signed off on his own theft. Your mother co-signed. Every signature, every authorization code, every email. They left fingerprints all over their crimes. Jonathan leaned back, his expression somber. Aurora, they may not fully grasp what they've done, but we need to be strategic. If they suspect how much evidence we have, they may flee. My pulse quickened. They have passports. He nodded. We'll alert the Federal Financial Integrity Bureau quietly. For now, we proceed with the audit. By September 23rd, Dad struck first. He called an emergency board meeting, assembling 20 board members at the headquarters of Whitmore Estates Group. I wasn't invited, of course, but their bylaws required that all shareholders be given access, so Jonathan arranged for us to watch via a secure video link from the penthouse. The conference room appeared on screen, smooth wood table, city skyline behind the glass, board members shuffling papers. My parents sat near the center, Dad in his tailored suit, Mom beside him taking minutes as though she belonged there. Dad stood to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice projecting confidence he didn't deserve. While my father-in-law was a brilliant man, his final months were marked by confusion and erratic decision-making. Handing the entire company over to an inexperienced 27-year-old with no executive experience is irresponsible and dangerous. Some heads nodded, others looked unsure. I propose we invoke emergency leadership protocols, Dad continued. We need experienced management, myself as interim CEO, while the estate situation is resolved. But then something unexpected happened. Edward Langford, one of the longest-serving board members, stood up slowly. Darren, the will is clear. Leonard required an independent audit. Why not wait for the results? Dad's jaw tightened. Because every day of uncertainty costs us millions. Or, Vivian Hartley, head of the audit committee, said pointedly, it costs you millions. Gasps rippled across the room. Dad went pale. I've been contacted by Grant and Hale Forensics, Vivian continued. They've already begun preliminary work. They've found irregularities, Dad sputtered. If there were issues, they happened under Leonard's watch. Another reason for experienced leadership. The vote was called, 12 supporting Dad, 8 against. But they needed a 2/3 majority. The motion failed. We'll reconvene October 5th, Dad said through clenched teeth. By then, I expect everyone to understand what's truly at stake. Jonathan muted the feed. 8 members are willing to listen. That's more than we hoped. Cassandra nodded. By October 5th, they'll have a lot more to consider. The following days were a whirlwind. Hours of meetings, page after page of forensic reports. And what Cassandra's team found was beyond anything I'd imagined. Shell companies registered parking lots, fake vendors, wire transfers to offshore accounts controlled by my mother, trust funds set up in the names of children who didn't exist, pension funds used as collateral for personal loans. My parents hadn't just stolen, they had been methodical, relentless, fearless. On September 28th, Cassandra requested an urgent meeting. "We've uncovered something serious," she said. She spread out the latest findings. Each page was more damning than the last. "This isn't just civil fraud," she said. "This is criminal." Jonathan rubbed his forehead. "We need to plan how to reveal this. Too much at once, and they'll panic." For the first time, I felt something sharp settle behind my ribs. Not anger, clarity, determination. The sense that everything in my life had been leading to this moment, this reckoning. I looked at both of them. We move forward, however we need to. By October 1st, the audit reached 312 pages. Jonathan, Cassandra, and I spent hours strategizing for the board meeting, for the legal implications, for what would happen after. We contacted 8 neutral board members, ensuring they would attend. We prepared sealed copies of the audit, press kits for 3 major outlets, and arrangements for increased security. We were preparing for war. The night before the board meeting, I visited Grandpa's study alone. The chessboard was still waiting where we left it during our last game. I stared at the pieces, the knight angled just so, the queen poised for a finishing move. Suddenly, I understood. Grandpa had been setting up this board for years, and tomorrow, the king would fall. The following night, my father held a victory party at the Midwest Executive Club. 48 hours before the board meeting, he believed would crown him CEO. Investors, shareholders, allies he'd groomed for years, everyone mingled around him with flutes of champagne, toasting the future of Whitmore Estates Group. Jonathan and I watched from the sidelines, unnoticed. Dad raised his glass near the fireplace, the Tiffany Legacy diamonds on my mother's wrist catching the light. "By Monday," he declared, "our leadership transition will be complete. Leonard's legacy will continue exactly as he intended." Mom dabbed dramatically at her eyes, playing the grieving, devoted daughter. People applauded. They had no idea what was coming. As Jonathan and I walked out, he checked his phone. "Cassandra confirms everything's set. Security will be in position. Grant and Hale will be there at 8:30 sharp." I nodded, staring at the glittering city outside the club windows. 36 hours until impact. 36 hours until truth replaced illusion. 36 hours until I stood in front of the board and turned my parents' empire of lies into dust. If you're still following along, leave a comment to let me know, because soon, truth and justice will be revealed in a way they least expect. October 5th arrived with the kind of gray Chicago sky that felt almost symbolic, muted, heavy, like the air itself sensed something monumental was about to unfold. When Jonathan and I stepped out of the car in front of the Grand Lakes Continental Hotel, a strange calm settled over me. Not the absence of fear, but a clarity beneath it, like stepping onto a stage after rehearsing your lines for years without knowing you were preparing. The corridors leading toward the Park Avenue ballroom were buzzing with murmurs. Board members, shareholders, assistants carrying binders. Everyone seemed to move with a quiet urgency. As we approached the doors, I caught glimpses of familiar faces from company events throughout my childhood. These were people who had watched me grow up, people who believed they knew me. Today, they'd see a different version. Inside, the ballroom was arranged with sharp precision. A long horseshoe table for the board, a gallery behind it for shareholders, and at the front, a podium where my father stood proudly in a perfectly pressed Brooks Brothers suit. My mother, immaculate in her baby blue St. John's set, sat in the front row with the stern posture of a woman who'd already predicted victory. They didn't even glance in my direction. That alone told me how confident they felt. At exactly 9 o'clock, the board president called the meeting to order. Dad stepped forward immediately, like a man stepping into a spotlight he believed belonged only to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth as polished marble, "we're here today to ensure Whitmore Estates Group continues forward with strength and stability." Leonard was a visionary, but his final decisions were clouded. "We must protect this company from impulsive transitions." He clicked a remote, and a slideshow appeared behind him, a curated history of the company's growth, each graph rising impressively. But I already knew what those numbers concealed. "As chief financial strategist for nearly 15 years, he continued, "it is my responsibility to provide continuity. I propose we invoke Emergency Provision 18B and transfer executive authority to myself until the estate matters are resolved." He said the words with such rehearsed conviction that some board members looked uncertain, even sympathetic. Mom gave him a small, knowing smile. She truly believed the performance was flawless. But the moment he finished speaking, the board president asked, "Any discussion before we vote?" I rose to my feet. "I object to this motion." The sound of my voice seemed to ripple across the room. Dad froze. My mother's expression shifted just slightly, enough for me to notice. "You're not on the agenda, Aurora," my father said, irritation crackling through his tone. "Actually," I replied, stepping forward with the legal folder in my hands, Clause 7. 3 of my grandfather's will grants me standing in any proceeding affecting the estate, and more importantly, I lifted the folder. "The board deserves to see the results of the audit Grandpa required." Confusion flickered across several faces. Dad's smile tightened. "This is highly irregular." But he stopped speaking the moment the doors opened. 6 auditors from Grant and Hale Forensics entered the ballroom in a quiet, disciplined formation, pushing carts stacked with 3 levels of sealed boxes. Behind them walked Cassandra Holt, tailored blazer, hair pulled back into a sleek twist, posture straight as a blade. Her presence shifted the atmosphere like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. She spoke clearly, without apology. "Mr. President, members of the board, I'm Cassandra Holt, lead forensic director at Grant and Hale. We've completed the audit required by Mr. Whitmore's will." The board president nodded. "We've been expecting you." Dad took a step forward. "This is unnecessary. These people are not approved." "Sit down, Darren," the board president said sharply. It was the first time I'd ever heard anyone speak to him like that. Cassandra connected her laptop to the projector. A title slide appeared in crisp lettering. "Whitmore Estates Group, Forensic Audit Summary, 2010 to 2025. My father took a half step backward. My mother's fingers curled into tight fists on her lap. Cassandra began, her voice steady. "Over the past 15 years, our audit has uncovered systematic irregularities totaling $230 million in confirmed unauthorized transfers. When accounting for lost interest, shadow subsidiaries, and opportunity losses, total liability may reach $520 million. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, sharp inhales, whispered curses. Dad's voice cracked. "That's absurd! These figures—" Cassandra clicked to the next slide. A spiderweb diagram of money flows, each red line pointing to an offshore account or shell company. These transfers were authorized using approval codes belonging to Darren Miller and Elaine Miller. The majority were processed through entities such as Blue Ridge Meridian LLC and Whitmore Horizon LLC, both registered offshore under Mrs. Miller's control. Mom blanched. "That's a lie," she whispered, but the denial sounded hollow even to her. Cassandra nodded to her team. "Distribute the binders." Auditors placed thick audit reports in front of each board member. Some members immediately began flipping pages, others simply stared, stunned. "For example," Cassandra continued, "Mrs. Miller authorized 73 transfers totaling $37 million to Blue Ridge Meridian LLC, a shell entity with no employees, no office, and no operational history." Mom shook her head, voice trembling. I don't understand. I never—" Cassandra advanced the slide again. Mom's digital signatures filled the screen, page after page. Dad lunged toward the podium. "These expenses were legitimate. Development fees. Then explain, Cassandra said calmly, why Whitmore Estates Group paid $4 million in consulting for the Milwaukee waterfront project a full year after the project was canceled. Silence. Then outrage. Board members murmured angrily. Shareholders exchanged horrified looks. The journalists at the back of the room, who were definitely not supposed to be there but had been quietly invited, typed in furious bursts. My father's shoulders tensed. This is completely out of context. Cassandra clicked to the next slide. A 2019 email appeared in bold letters. From Darren Miller. To offshore account manager. Subject: hide this from Leonard at all costs. Another gasp tore through the room. Dad's face drained of all color. Mom covered her mouth, eyes wide. The room was turning against them in real time, the tide shifting with every piece of evidence. As you can see, Cassandra said, not only were funds deliberately concealed, but attempts were made to delete records from Whitmore servers, actions that violate state and federal law. The board president's jaw tightened. This is criminal. The next slide was even worse. Employee pension funds, Cassandra said quietly, were used as collateral for personal loans taken out by Darren Miller. That was the breaking point. Several board members shouted. Others stared at my parents with thinly veiled disgust. My father tried one final tactic, grasping at the familiar patterns of blame. I didn't handle the offshore accounts, he snapped. Elaine did, Mom spun toward him. How dare you? But Cassandra pressed a button on her tablet. Actually, she said, after 2020, Mr. Miller began using DocuSign for most approvals. Here is one from last month. $800,000 to a non-existent vendor linked to your brother-in-law, Stuart Delaney. The camera caught Stuart's face in the gallery. He stood abruptly and walked out. Dad stared at the screen, as if sheer denial could erase the truth. But the truth didn't care about denial. The moment Stuart fled the room, a heavy silence followed him, one that wrapped itself around every corner of the ballroom. It felt like the air thickened, settling into an unspoken understanding. The foundation beneath my parents' entire life had finally cracked wide open. Dad's shoulders hunched as if he were carrying not just the weight of the accusations, but the sudden realization that he had run out of exits. Mom stared at the table, her face pale, her mascara smudging beneath her eyes. The woman who had once perfected the art of public poise suddenly looked human, terrified, shaken, shrinking inside a reality she never believed would touch her. Cassandra let the silence linger for a breath before she delivered the final blow. This audit, she said, her voice steady, contains 312 pages of verified evidence, each cross-referenced and authenticated. We also obtained notarized statements from 4 employees who were instructed to mislabel expenses. 2 of them claim they did so under direct pressure from Mr. Miller. A low murmur spread across the room. I watched my father's expression break, subtle at first, a flicker of panic in his eyes, then a tightening around his jaw as if he was fighting against emotions he refused to acknowledge. His fingers curled into fists against the podium, knuckles whitening. He tried to speak. This is all... But his voice cracked, and the weakness in that moment exposed everything he'd been hiding behind authority and performance. Cassandra closed her folder. That concludes the audit summary. The board president, who had spent the last 20 minutes flipping quickly through his copy of the report, set it down with a decisive thud. This is not just negligence, he said. This is orchestrated, calculated theft. Jonathan stepped forward with another sealed envelope. Mr. President, he said, I have a letter from Mr. Whitmore to be read at the conclusion of the audit. A wave of stillness swept across the room. Even the shareholders in the gallery leaned in. The board president opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. His voice softened, taking on the weight of the words written by a man who had foreseen everything. To the board of Whitmore Estates Group, if you are hearing this, then the evidence has been presented. I gathered this documentation over the course of 3 years. I did so because I needed the truth to speak louder than excuses. Aurora refused to sign fraudulent documents. She refused to compromise her integrity. She is the only person I trust to guard this company's future. Honor the values on which Whitmore Estates Group was built. Leonard Whitmore. When the board president finished reading, he rested the letter on the table with care, as if it were something fragile. My parents looked hollow. Dad stared at the carpet, his chest rising and falling unevenly. My mother pressed trembling hands together, as if trying to hold herself still. The board president broke the quiet. I am calling an immediate vote on the removal of Darren Miller from his position as chief financial strategist and on banning both Darren and Elaine Miller from any future involvement with Whitmore Estates Group. The words hung in the air like a sentence delivered in a courtroom. Seconded, said Vivian Hartley, her voice firm. All in favor? Hands went up, quickly, decisively, almost unanimously. 19 raised, 1 abstained. Motion passes. Mom inhaled sharply, a soft, strangled sound escaping her throat. Dad closed his eyes as if bracing for a physical impact. For a fleeting moment, he didn't look like a man who had orchestrated a decade of fraud. He looked like someone who finally realized the consequences had arrived. But the reckoning wasn't over. The board president turned toward me. We now move to the matter of leadership. Miss Miller, are you prepared to step into the role of interim CEO? A ripple moved through the room. Every eye turned to me. Something inside me steadied, an old, quiet strength that Grandpa must have seen long before I ever recognized it. Yes, I said, my voice even. I'm prepared. Motion to appoint Aurora Miller as interim CEO, effective immediately. Seconded. All in favor? Every hand raised, unanimous. For a moment the room seemed to blur, not in a dizzying way, but with a soft cinematic haze, like every sound, every face, every motion stretched into something meaningful. The applause began, gentle at first, then building into something that didn't feel like celebration, but validation, recognition. When it died down, security stepped inside the ballroom, not aggressively, not with handcuffs, but with the calm authority of people who had been waiting for a signal. One of them spoke softly, "Mr. Miller, Mrs. Miller, we need you to come with us." My mother's lips trembled. "Aurora, sweetheart, please." But the word sweetheart felt strange, brittle, misaligned with every memory I had of her. It wasn't love. It was desperation. A grasping attempt at connection now that her world was slipping away. "We're family," my father said hoarsely. "Family doesn't turn on each other." I looked at him, truly looked. The man who sat before me was not the father I once wished he were. He was someone who had prioritized ambition over ethics, image over sincerity, power over love. And in that moment, the truth came to me so clearly, I could feel it in my bones. "Family doesn't steal from the people they're supposed to protect," I said quietly. "Family doesn't pressure their daughter into signing illegal documents. Family doesn't throw her out when she refuses to lie." He flinched. Mom looked down, tears hitting the tablecloth like tiny fragile impacts. Security moved closer. "Please," Mom whispered, her voice cracking. "Please don't let them." But I shook my head. "I didn't do this to you," I said softly. "You did this to yourselves." She covered her face. Dad didn't speak again. Security guided them toward the exit. Their silhouettes, once tall and commanding, seemed smaller than I'd ever seen. The doors swung open, and they disappeared down the corridor. When the room settled again, the board president approached me with an expression somewhere between relief and respect. "Miss Miller," he said, "your grandfather was right about you." Jonathan touched my shoulder gently, pride warming his features. Cassandra offered a nod, subtle but sincere. I exhaled, slow, steady, grounding. Because beneath the shock, beneath the intensity of everything that had unfolded, something new had begun forming in me. Not triumph, not vengeance, purpose. A quiet purpose that felt like stepping into the version of myself Grandpa had always believed I could be. I wasn't standing in anyone's shadow anymore. I wasn't the backup plan, the contingency, the silent occupant of a home that never felt like mine. I was the one holding the reins now, and for the first time in my life, I felt ready to lead. The rest of the day unfolded with a kind of surreal clarity, like the world kept moving but my body hadn't quite caught up to it yet. The board meeting ended at 11:07 a.m., and by 11:35, Chicago already knew everything. The first push notification vibrated on my phone while I was still standing in the hallway outside the ballroom. Breaking: massive fraud exposed inside Whitmore Estates Group. Granddaughter named interim CEO. Chicago Financial Tribune, 05/10/2024. Within an hour, the story spread across every major financial platform. American Wealth Review wrote, "The Whitmore Purge, a corporate house cleaning years overdue." Finance 360 opened with a live segment titled, "Crisis or Renewal? Real-time breakdown of the Whitmore scandal." Analysts didn't condemn us, they praised the speed of the cleanup. Stock prices, which had dipped after Grandpa passed, spiked nearly 12% by close of day. Commentators said investors responded positively because leadership acted decisively, transparently, and without hesitation. It felt strange to become the public face of a crisis within hours of stepping into the role. Strange, but steady, like I was finally stepping into a room where the lights had been off my whole life, and suddenly I could see. By mid-afternoon, we released our first official company statement under my name, clear, neutral, factual, no dramatics. Whitmore Estates Group confirms the removal of Darren and Elaine Miller from all roles. The board has unanimously appointed Aurora E. Miller as interim CEO. The company will cooperate fully with regulators and commit to implementing a strengthened transparency framework effective immediately. Employees started emailing within minutes: front desk workers, regional managers, maintenance supervisors, finance analysts. One message simply read, "Thank you for protecting us." It hit harder than any headline. That evening we held an emergency all-hands meeting. Almost 3,000 employees joined virtually, many still in uniforms or sitting in break rooms between shifts. I didn't sugarcoat anything. "Some of you may have learned today that your pensions were used improperly," I said. "I know that's frightening, and I'm sorry you were put in that position. But I promise you this, every account will be restored, every irregularity corrected, and every future audit will be independent and external." Silence. Then applause. Not thunderous, just steady, like a heartbeat returning after shock. In the 3 weeks that followed, we moved fast. We reinstated every pension. We hired a permanent forensic compliance officer. We implemented anonymous reporting channels. We updated dozens of policies that had been untouched for years. Employees wrote the nicest things, simple, honest notes. "Feels like we're finally breathing again. This is the first time I'm not scared to look at my retirement account." It wasn't joy I felt. Not yet. But it was purpose. As for my parents, consequences came quicker than anyone expected. The Federal Financial Integrity Bureau froze all accounts linked to the offshore transfers. The Federal Fraud Enforcement Division issued warrants 2 weeks after the board meeting, timely enough to stop them from leaving the country. Flights to Switzerland had already been booked. Their charges were severe: wire fraud, misuse of pension, collateral financial misconduct, conspiracy to defraud, attempted destruction of internal documents. Because the evidence was overwhelming, their lawyers pushed toward a plea agreement. The ruling, 5 years probation, a 10-year ban from any financial or executive role, mandatory cooperation with investigators, restitution, totaling $220 million, structured over 10 years, 2-year therapy requirement with Dr. Brooks. The Lakeview brownstone was sold off quickly. Cars, jewelry, club memberships, gone. They relocated to a modest walk-up in Cicero. My father found a new job as a regional strategy advisor, making $82,000 a year, a fraction of what he once earned. My mother served community service hours at a food pantry. According to Jonathan, She kept volunteering even after her required hours ended. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want them. Distance was necessary. Exactly 5 weeks after the board meeting, we met with them for legally required mediation. The conference room felt cold, too brightly lit. They sat on one end with their lawyers. I sat on the other with Jonathan. I had rehearsed what I needed to say. Not out loud, just the way people rehearse confrontations in the privacy of their minds. "These are my conditions," I said, sliding the documents forward. "Restitution must be completed in full. Mandatory therapy reports must reflect real accountability, not excuses. No direct contact with me for 5 years. All communication goes through Jonathan. A comprehensive NDA about company matters. Violations trigger immediate legal response, a written acknowledgement of wrongdoing. No vague language, no misunderstandings." My mother whispered, "Aurora, please." My father clenched his jaw, but they signed. Watching their signatures shake was not satisfying. It was simply inevitable. Security escorted them out after the meeting. My mother glanced back once, a fractured expression crossing her face. My father stared straight ahead. I didn't call out to them. Some doors must remain closed for a while, maybe forever. Maybe. Back at Whitmore Estates, the rebuilding continued at a pace that felt both exhausting and exhilarating. Employee morale is back. Deals that had stalled reopened. Vendors commented on the new energy. We didn't try to sweep the scandal under the rug or pretend it never happened. We did the opposite. We used it as a blueprint for what not to allow ever again. We established an ethics committee chaired by Vivian Hartley. We have scheduled quarterly independent audits each year to maintain regular clarity and transparency, to prevent mistakes before they happen. We designed a whistleblower program with protections so airtight no one would dare retaliate. Our internal culture began to shift quickly. People felt safer, clearer, more stable. I received an email from Stanford GSB confirming my acceptance into their executive MBA. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling a complicated mix of relief and disbelief. Grandpa had always wanted me to pursue it. He must have smiled. And even though these programs haven't started yet, I feel like this is the start of something real. We scheduled a company gathering for mid-November. Nothing fancy like my parents usually staged, but cozy and casual. Lights in the lobby, local food served, a board thanking the staff not with fake smiles, but with sincere words. The event wasn't until a week later, but planning had already filled the office with a quiet hum of anticipation. During a preparation meeting, Vivian nudged me. "You should say something at the gathering," she said. "People need to hear from the person who saved the company." I wasn't sure how to respond. I didn't feel like a savior. I felt like someone who made the choice they couldn't avoid anymore. But I agreed. That night, back at my penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Jonathan handed me a small envelope forwarded from his office. "It's from them," he said quietly. "My parents." I held it carefully. The handwriting, my mother's, looked smaller than usual, like she had forced herself to write slowly. I didn't open it, not out of anger, out of tenderness for the part of me that still needed time. I placed the envelope on the mantel beside a photo of Grandpa and me at the chessboard. His eyes crinkled in a smile, forever mid-laugh. Then I walked to the chess table. The pieces were still in the same position from our last game together. I moved the knight exactly where he wanted it that final weekend. Checkmate. Not against my parents. Against silence. Against fear. Against the version of myself who believed she had to stay small to be loved. I imagined speaking directly to the people listening to this story, strangers in different time zones, different cities, different lives. And I said softly, "If this story reached you at the right moment, please know you're allowed to choose integrity over approval. You're allowed to step away from people who hurt you, even if they share your last name. Thank you for staying with me. If this story resonated, please like the video, it truly helps. Truly, Subscribe for more stories about finding your voice, reclaiming your strength, and stepping into the life you deserve. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing who's on the other side of the story. Until next time, stay honest, stay brave, and remember, integrity isn't just a value. It's the moment you decide not to betray yourself.